Welcome back to Sauce Bureau, your number one source for recommendations. It's spooky season, the best time of year to dive deep into all things horror. In this video, I'm going to be talking about some horror manga I've been reading recently, which you might be interested in, especially with Halloween right around the corner. I do want to warn you that the following series deal with all sorts of graphic content, some of which may be triggering, so please be aware of this if you decide to read any of the manga discussed in this video. I also highly suggest you review the tags of each series to make sure you're comfortable with what you might be getting into. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's talk about the first horror manga on the list. Starting off with a completed series, Hitode-Chan is a bit of a strange one, the story and the character, but we'll get back to her in a bit. The series starts off with a pretty gruesome scene involving a high school student and what appears to be a freak accident. We soon find out this was actually caused by Seishiro Takamori, who is targeting certain students due to how they're treating the girl he's supposedly fallen in love with. As he comes from a family of priests, Seishiro discovers an older shrine under their jurisdiction after reading a tale of a demon known to curse specific people through a ritual. Hoping to get rid of those taking advantage of his crush, his efforts have of course shown success, but things start to go wrong when the demon begins targeting the wrong students instead. Seishiro actually ends up taking a backseat here as the focus of the story shifts to different characters. Hitode-Chan is essentially an exorcist sent to the school to deal with the demon. Another student in the class, Sato, is shown to have some kind of sensitivity to the supernatural, and Hitode-Chan basically recruits him to help. While I think the two working together isn't bad, this should have been the plan from the start because the mangaka spends a bit too much time on showing Sato's POV of what's happened so far, which there is a reason for, but there's also him getting to know Hitode-Chan more since they're now in cahoots. This is okay, but it feels a bit out of place considering everything that's come before with Seishiro and the fact that the two new characters don't really work together. It's more like Hitode-Chan found someone who's similar to her, but ultimately just sees use in him to help get the job done. It's also heavily implied that Sato has feelings for the same girl that Seishiro is crushing on, which is why he ends up assisting Hitode-Chan, but I just don't get why there's so much focus on a character we barely see. If Aoi wasn't in the manga and the story was about Seishiro getting revenge on bullies using the demon and then having to deal with it getting out of control, that would be fine. If Aoi and Seishiro weren't in the manga and it was about Hitode and Sato going around dealing with supernatural anomalies, that would be even better. Instead, we get a series that ends after 17 chapters with a pretty bad conclusion, so I just can't recommend this one, but it is a quick read if you choose to check it out. Next up is a currently ongoing series in Shonen Jump Plus, which you can officially read in English on Manga Plus. Ryota Killed His Brother follows two siblings who are really close, but of course the title being what it is, we know something's wrong, which is that Chi, the younger brother, seems to be housing some kind of eldritch horror inside him. We find out older brother Ryota is feeling stressed out because all the responsibility for Chi is now on him, since their mother passed away and their dad is always working. Combined with the dark thoughts he was already having towards his younger brother due to this, and what that could lead to given the title and the fact that Chi is apparently not even human, the series could have been quite interesting, but it very quickly becomes a dumpster fire and currently all hell has broken loose. The manga even introduces side characters that are willing to step up and help Ryota as they start to discover what Chi really is. However, they basically just end up being numbers added to the overall casualties, which is honestly pretty unfortunate, especially when you consider one of these characters seems to be similar to Chi. Now, those characters are still alive due to some things that happen in the manga, which you'll see if you choose to read it, but there are some very strange decisions being made here, and I can't say much about this one that's positive. I recently caught up to Mad Miniscape, which has actually been licensed by Yen Press, and Volume 1 will be coming out early next year, so definitely support the English release if you can. This manga follows Asahi, who was living with her childhood friend Minoru, someone who apparently passed away many years ago. Of course, Minoru isn't actually Minoru, but he's now with Asahi due to a promise they made, one I don't think you'd want to be making. Fake Minoru is shown to be a bit of a troublemaker, but Asahi is able to keep him in check for the most part. But things start to get complicated when Minoru's younger brother Wataru gets involved. He understands that fake Minoru can actually be the real deal, but he seems to be getting influenced by him somehow and will likely end up playing a big role in what fake Minoru ultimately wants to accomplish. Asahi is also low-key insane and is perfectly okay with fake Minoru living with her since that's been her goal from the start. However, she starts to lose control over the situation when fake Minoru becomes more aggressive. Reality starts to shift for Asahi as she finds herself dealing with her own mind betraying her and experiencing events that may or may not actually be real. I'm curious if this is a psychological attack from fake Minoru or if Asahi is somehow doing it to herself given how crazy she is, since we see her freaking out in one scene but shortly after it's business as usual. So maybe she's subconsciously giving herself reasons to fulfill her desires by any means necessary. We also begin to learn more about the trio through flashbacks that provide reasons as to why they're in this situation in the first place, which is of course because of Asahi, but I won't spoil that for you, just go and see for yourself. Mad Miniscape is interesting. It's got mystery, it's got suspense, and it's got a lot of creepy scenes which I enjoy seeing in horror manga, so I think this one is worth giving a chance. Next up, we have a manga that consists of two different stories, Hanging Town and the story of how I couldn't enter the mountains. Since Hanging Town takes up most of the chapter count and has been fully translated, we'll primarily focus on that. Taking place in the 1970s, the story deals with a town plagued by the supernatural. At first, incidents only take place on a mountain near the town, but soon enough, residents begin experiencing strange events such as wild animals showing up in town to scavenge, random typhoons and earthquakes, even mysterious hanging. Despite attempts to purify and stop whatever's causing this, members of the town's Shinomiya shrine have been unsuccessful. Granny Shizu, a priestess from the Shinomiya shrine, comes to the conclusion this is all the result of a vengeful spirit, which has been materialized due to the grudge of multiple souls. During a town hall meeting, the area's dark history is revealed, and Granny Shizu learns of the exact cause of what's been happening. She states the gods won't be able to protect them, so she ends up taking it upon herself to try and appease the spirits by allowing them to take their grudge out on her instead, which does free the town, but only temporarily. The other characters we've seen so far start to play a bigger role now as Satsuki, the youngest of the Shinomiya family, begins to have visions of the torture Granny Shizu is going through and ends up replacing her to keep the town safe. Keita, who has actually come into contact with the spirit previously, is asked by God to help Satsuki so they can appease the lingering grudge once and for all and save the town. This manga is just okay. The town horror setting is something we've seen many times before and it's not something I have any issues with, but this one ultimately just ends up being a torture fest. It's very basic and the problems are solved by sacrificing one person while everyone else gets to go on with their lives. Hanging Town is ultimately very average, not great but also not terrible. Another ongoing series, this one is more survival horror and similar to some movies you might be familiar with, such as The Cave, The Descent, and As Above, So Below. Hajime has just returned from Tokyo and reunites with old friends including Umi, whose younger brother went missing over a decade ago. The group decides to explore a cave they apparently visited when they were kids, which has a reputation as an urban legend for being the man-eating cave, and people are told to stay away from the mountain where it's located. That's not going to stop them, of course, as they head to the mountain to visit the cave once more. On their way up, they stop by an old shrine where they once again receive a warning to stay away. Remember this guy because we'll get back to him. They discover the cave's entrance has collapsed, and if they had just turned back here, they would have been perfectly fine, but curiosity gets the better of them and they end up falling right into the cave. Once inside, they encounter a creature carrying the head of a live streamer who recently came to the town to investigate the urban legend. The creature runs away and the group finds various items belonging to children, which is important since the last traces of Umi's brother were by the mountain's entrance. As the group tries to find their way out, they inevitably get separated and end up going deeper into the cave. I've enjoyed reading this one so far because there's a lot happening here that's honestly really intriguing. The creatures themselves are just one threat to the group since we've seen our characters hallucinating and seeing things that aren't actually there. Umi is a badass and Buddy is immediately willing to throw hands, which I think is pretty funny, but if he ends up losing his mind or even turning into one of the creatures, he's going to be a problem. I say this because the creatures seem to be part of what appears to be a cult, which leads me to believe people who fall into the cave may actually be getting turned, and maybe that's what happened to Umi's brother. If this is the case, there does seem to be certain criteria that has to be met, otherwise the live streamer would have still been alive, so maybe it's only men who get turned. This is possible since we see the cave cult guy tell Riku it's not their time, and when Hajime ends up being imprisoned, they're trying to keep him alive by feeding him, although their menu doesn't look very appetizing. Hajime also discovers some kind of diary, which might be the key to getting out, and I wonder who left it there and how useful it'll be since the person who wrote it seemed to be gradually losing their sanity. As if what's happening in the cave wasn't bad enough, there's also something going on outside, which is another problem entirely. One of Riku's co-workers notices he hasn't shown up for his shift, and based on everyone's reaction, he starts to realize they know more than they're letting on, especially since they're avoiding the exact area they should be searching. He contacts Riku's wife Sana, who is very paranoid, and she immediately assumes the worst has happened. Sana wants to go to the mountain to find Riku, but unfortunately she gets kidnapped and ends up being thrown into the cave. By who? The cult I mentioned that apparently this old dude we saw earlier is a prominent figure of. Maybe the people who have disappeared have been purposely sacrificed to the cave to appease the so-called cave god, but we'll have to see where that takes us since there's definitely a connection between the people above ground and below ground as they're essentially worshipping the same entity. I definitely think Sana being thrown into the cave will cause chaos since Riku won't be able to tell it's actually her given what we've seen with his hallucinations, but here's hoping that doesn't turn out to be the case. Like I said, there's a lot to digest here and I look forward to reading more of the story and I think you should check it out. I just hope we get explanations and the story isn't rushed, but I guess we'll just have to be patient. saving the best for last, you should absolutely read A Manga Someone Drew. This is essentially a collection of short stories, but what's unique about this one is the concept. This manga starts off with the author basically saying that what we're about to read is based on existing manuscripts discovered on a second-hand PC they purchased, and for some reason the art style found in those files resembles their own. While this is probably made up to fit the narrative of the manga, I think it's a great idea. It's honestly quite interesting how this manga is presented and how many possibilities there are to tell various stories with this premise. The actual manga itself is pretty creepy, and I like that the author switches it up in different ways, whether it's providing commentary on the specific chapter's story or completely changing the art style. If the original files they're supposedly referencing are corrupted, we get to see that. The author even has segments where they talk about possible supernatural occurrences they experience because of the computer. For example, the author mentions after finishing up a chapter, they notice the original manuscript has changed and panels have somehow been altered. Another example is when the author tells a story about an encounter they had in their room. So we not only have stories being created from existing images on the computer, but stories about supernatural events due to being near the computer. The author also creates stories based on events in their life, and there's just so much you could talk about here using this concept, so I'm glad there's an effort to keep it fresh and not just show the exact same thing every chapter. Speaking of showing, as you read this manga, you might notice a large focus on the chapters released so far have to do with sight. One story deals with the curse video where a woman turns to look at the screen, and if you see her face, bad things will happen. A different story involves floaters that will attack anyone in your line of sight, which is honestly pretty terrifying. Like, how do you even come up with that? There are of course other stories that don't follow this theme, but something to note is whenever the author shows up to talk to us, they don't show their face, which may be building up to something later on, but we'll just have to see what happens. Anyway, there you have it, 6 horror manga reads you might be interested in with Halloween coming up. Let me know in the comments which of these series you might be checking out, and if you happen to be reading any of them right now, feel free to share what you think of them so far. Regardless of what you'll be getting up to on the 31st, whether it's going out for candy, hanging out with friends or family, or even just reading some horror manga recommended by yours truly, I hope you have a safe and happy Halloween. As always, thank you so much for coming to Saw Spiro. I hope you found a new series to read from your visit, and hope you return soon.